The moment Renata Voss looked down at the menu and felt her stomach drop, she knew this evening was about to become the most humbling night of her life. She had dressed carefully, borrowed her neighbor's perfume, and told herself this was just a casual dinner. Nothing serious, nothing scary. But now, sitting across from a man she had only known for 3 weeks, in a restaurant where even the bread basket felt like it cost more than her electric bill, the truth pressed itself against her chest like a fist. She could not afford this, not even close, and she was going to have to say it out loud. Before we go any further into this story, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet courage it takes to be honest when pride wants you to stay silent, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. And we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. This community spans the entire globe, and every single one of you matters. Renata had not always been the kind of woman who counted coins before leaving the house. There was a time, not so very long ago, when she had a salary that made sense, an apartment that felt like hers, and a version of her future that looked the way she had always imagined it would. She had worked as a coordinator for a mid-sized event planning company in the city for 6 years, building a life that was modest but stable, warm but not extravagant. She had friends, plans for weekends, a gym membership she actually used. And then, in the span of 14 months, 3 things happened that peeled all of that away like old paint from a wall. First came her mother's illness, a sudden cardiac episode that required surgery, followed by months of rehabilitation that Renata's mother could not afford alone. Renata had stepped in without hesitation, the way she always did, the way the oldest daughter in a family of limited means always does. She had dipped into her savings, redirected her budget, and quietly rearranged her entire financial life to make room for her mother's recovery. She did not resent it. That was simply who she was. Then came the layoff. The company restructured. Renata's entire department was dissolved in a single afternoon meeting, handed severance envelopes, and thanked for their years of service with the kind of hollow corporate warmth that made the whole thing feel even colder. She had been 31 years old, standing on the sidewalk outside the office with a cardboard box and a paper coffee cup, trying to call her best friend before the grief had a chance to fully arrive. She found another job eventually, a part-time administrative role at a nonprofit that paid her just enough to keep the lights on and the rent current, but left nothing for margins or extras or anything that resembled the life she used to have. And then, there was Marcus. That was the third thing. Marcus was not a catastrophe in the way her mother's illness or the layoff had been. He was quieter damage. The kind that comes from spending 2 years building your emotional world inside someone else's, only to discover that person never quite let you in the way you thought. The breakup was not dramatic. There was no screaming, no betrayal in the classic sense. Marcus had simply looked at her one Sunday morning over coffee and said he did not think they were going anywhere, and Renata had nodded like she understood because she did understand. She just had not wanted to. She had moved out of their shared apartment 3 months later, into a smaller place with a radiator that knocked and windows that let in the cold, and she had begun again from a number much lower than 0. By the time she met Callum Dre, Renata had been in her careful, threadbare new life for nearly 8 months. She had stopped going to restaurants unless someone else suggested it, and even then, she always ate a small meal at home first, so she could order only something inexpensive without it being obvious. She had stopped buying coffee from cafes. She took her lunch to work in a container she washed and reused. She was not ashamed of any of this. She was surviving, and surviving with integrity. But she did carry a low, persistent ache that came from the distance between who she had been and who she was now. And some days, that ache was louder than others. She had met Callum at the nonprofit's annual fundraiser, where she had been managing registration, and he had arrived slightly late, flustered and apologetic, wearing a jacket that did not quite fit the occasion but was clearly his best attempt. He had a kind face, the kind that looked like it had earned its lines, not accumulated them carelessly. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of something more than ordinary tiredness, and when he smiled, it arrived slowly, like something he was still learning to do again after a long time of not doing it. They had talked for 20 minutes over the registration table, longer than was necessary, about nothing and everything. He had made her laugh twice. She had made him laugh once. Before he left, he had asked if she would like to have dinner sometime, and she had said yes before she had thought it through. She learned more about him in the days that followed, through text conversations that were warm and thoughtful and never hurried. Callum Dre was 34 years old. He had a 7-year-old daughter named Ren, whom he was raising entirely on his own. His wife, Ren's mother, had left when Ren was 2, not out of cruelty, or at least not the kind that announced itself plainly, but out of a private unraveling that Callum had watched helplessly from the outside. She had struggled with her mental health, made choices that put distance between herself and everyone who loved her, and eventually simply was not there anymore. Callum had not spoken about this with bitterness. He had spoken about it with the particular exhaustion of someone who had done all of their grieving already and come out the other side not angrier, but quieter. He was a carpenter, not the kind who flipped houses for profit, but the kind who made furniture, repaired old things, built bookshelves and window frames and kitchen tables for people. He worked out of a small workshop attached to his house and took on as many commissions as he could manage around Ren's school schedule. By the time he asked her to dinner, a real dinner, not coffee, he had said, because he wanted to do this properly, Renata had already told herself to be careful. Not careful in the guarded, self-protective way she had been careful with Marcus, but careful in the way you are careful with something that matters. Because Callum already mattered, she could feel it. And the restaurant he had chosen was the kind that mattered too. The kind with white tablecloths and soft lighting and prices that required a level of financial confidence she no longer had. She had looked up the menu online before going, the way she always did now, preparing herself, and she had looked at the numbers and felt that familiar tightening in her chest. The least expensive entree was $38. A glass of wine was $16. With tax and tip, an ordinary dinner for 2 would approach $200, and $200 was more than Renata had allowed herself to spend on anything that was not rent, groceries, or her mother's medication in the past 6 months. She had sat with her phone in her hands for a long time, trying to decide whether to cancel, whether to suggest somewhere else, whether to simply go and order nothing and claim she was not hungry. In the end, she had gone. She had put on the dark red dress she had bought 3 years ago when things were different, and she had told herself to be present, to be there with him, and to not let the numbers ruin the evening. But now, sitting across from Callum in the warm light of the restaurant, with her menu open and the prices looking at her with what felt like personal hostility, she found she could not pretend. She had tried to scan the page casually, as if choosing were simply a matter of preference and not calculation, but her face had betrayed her. She could feel it, the stillness in her expression, the slight tension around her eyes. And when she finally looked up, Callum was already watching her with a steadiness that made her feel simultaneously seen and terrified. She had said it quietly, without drama, looking directly at him, because she was too tired and too proud to let it come out as anything less than honest. She had told him she could not afford this, not the way it deserved to be afforded, not without it causing real stress. And she was sorry because she knew he had chosen this place with care, but she could not sit here pretending, and she needed him to know. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Renata had counted them, or something inside her had, the way you count seconds during a thunderstorm to measure how close the lightning was. She had watched his face for the flinch she was expecting, the discomfort, the awkwardness, the slight recalibration of whatever idea he had formed of her. But that was not what she saw. What she saw instead was something she had not anticipated at all. Callum had closed his menu. He had set it down on the table with deliberate gentleness, as if the gesture itself was part of what he wanted to say, and then he had leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, and he had told her something that would reroute the entire evening, and, she would realize only much later, the entire direction of what came next between them. He told her that he was glad she had said it, that he had almost said the same thing himself, that he had chosen this restaurant because he had panicked slightly when asking her, wanting to impress her, wanting to do it right, and he had opened a search on his phone and clicked the first result that looked appropriately serious without stopping to think about whether serious and expensive were the same thing, because they were not. He told her that he had looked at the menu when they sat down and felt a cold thread of anxiety because the truth was, this month had been lean. A commission had been delayed, Ren had needed new shoes and a school trip deposit and a birthday present for a classmate, and the kind of dinner this restaurant represented was not where he actually lived right now either. He had been sitting across from her, trying to look calm, hoping she would not notice the way he was calculating in his head. He told her that he had a better idea if she was willing to trust him. He told her to give him 10 minutes. What followed was not what Renata had imagined a first real date could be. Callum had spoken to the server, quietly and without embarrassment, and they had left the restaurant, not in a cloud of awkwardness or defeat, but somehow lighter, both of them almost laughing as they stepped out onto the pavement into the cool evening air. He had taken her to a grocery store 2 blocks away, the kind with bright buzzing lights and children in the cereal aisle and carts that veered slightly to the left. He had handed her a basket and said they were going to cook together if she was willing, at his house, because Ren was at his sister's for the night, and his kitchen was small but real, and he made, he said with very little false modesty, an exceptional pasta. They had walked the aisles together, choosing ingredients, good pasta, canned tomatoes, fresh basil, a wedge of Parmesan, a bottle of wine that cost $11 and turned out to be perfectly fine. They had argued cheerfully over whether garlic bread was necessary. It was, Renata had insisted, and she had been correct. The total at the register had been $31 and change, and Callum had paid it with the ease of a man who understood that $31 spent well could mean more than $300 spent anxiously. His house was small and warm and smelled like sawdust and something faintly sweet, like a candle that had recently been put out. There was evidence of Ren everywhere. Small shoes by the door, a drawing taped to the refrigerator, a stuffed rabbit sitting in a chair at the kitchen table with the resigned dignity of a long-term resident. Renata had looked at all of it and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was still clenched. They had cooked together in his narrow kitchen, bumping elbows and spilling a little wine and talking in the easy, unguarded way that only happens when 2 people have stopped performing and started simply being near each other. Callum had told her about Ren, her seriousness, her particular opinions about clouds and the correct way to eat an orange, the way she had once spent 40 minutes explaining to him why rabbits were more trustworthy than dogs, and the way he had listened to the whole argument and found he could not entirely disagree. Renata had talked about her mother, about the layoff, about the particular specific loneliness of rebuilding your life in your 30s when everyone around you seems to have already arrived somewhere you have not yet reached. She had said things she had not said out loud before, and the saying of them had not felt like confession so much as relief, the way putting down something heavy always is. They had eaten at his kitchen table under a light that was slightly too bright and next to the stuffed rabbit, and the pasta had been exactly as good as promised. They had stayed at that table for 3 hours after the food was gone, talking and then not talking, comfortable in both. When she had finally stood to leave, something had shifted permanently in the space between them. The kind of shift that you cannot unshift, that becomes part of the landscape going forward. Standing at his front door, she had turned to him and said thank you, meaning it in a way that words were only partially adequate for. He had told her that he should be thanking her, that the moment she had looked at him across that restaurant table and told him the truth, instead of performing a comfort she did not have, he had felt something he had forgotten was possible. He had felt like he was talking to someone real. He did not say it dramatically. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, with the weight of someone who had thought about it before speaking. She had driven home with the windows down despite the cold, needing the air, needing the night, needing a few minutes with the feeling before she had to put it somewhere. The feeling was this: that honesty, true honesty, the kind that risks your dignity and trusts the other person anyway, is not weakness. It is the very bravest thing. And that sometimes the person sitting across the table from you is carrying the same weight you are, behind a different expression, and all it takes is one of you to set it down first. In the months that followed, Renata and Callum built something slowly and carefully, the way you build anything that is meant to last. They did not rush. They navigated the delicate, important process of introducing Ren into the picture gradually, letting her lead the pace, letting trust grow at its own speed. Ren had regarded Renata for the first several weeks with the careful appraisal of a small person who has learned not to attach too quickly, and Renata had understood this completely, had not pushed, had simply been consistent and warm and present whenever she was there. And then one Saturday morning, Ren had climbed up onto the couch next to her without announcement and pressed her small self against Renata's side to watch a nature documentary about octopuses, and that was that. Some acceptances do not announce themselves. They simply happen, and then they have always been true. Renata found a better job, not a perfect one, not yet the version of her career she was still building toward, but a real one, full-time, with benefits and a salary that let her breathe again. Her mother's health stabilized. The apartment with the knocking radiator began to feel less like a temporary place and more like a home she had made for herself with her own two hands, and there was a dignity in that which she had not expected. There were still hard months. Callum's workshop had slow seasons. Renata's new job came with its own pressures and adjustments. Ren had a difficult stretch around her birthday, the invisible grief that children carry for things they cannot fully name surfacing quietly in changed behavior and small storms of feeling that took patience and steadiness to weather. None of it was easy, but none of it was faced alone, and that made a difference too fundamental to fully articulate. Looking back, Renata would return often to that moment in the restaurant, the menu in her hands, the prices on the page, and the decision to simply say the truth instead of absorbing the discomfort silently. She would return to it not with embarrassment, the way she might have expected, but with something closer to gratitude. Because the truth had not ended anything. It had begun everything. The truest, most solid, most genuinely alive thing she had ever been part of had started with her looking at a man she barely knew and telling him she could not afford to pretend. She had been afraid that admission would make her look small. Instead, it had made her free. And Callum, quiet, steady, carpenter-handed Callum, who had sat across from her in a restaurant he could not quite afford either, trying to do something right for the first time in a long time, had understood, had matched her honesty with his own, had chosen a grocery store and a narrow kitchen and a stuffed rabbit at a kitchen table over the performance of something neither of them needed. That choice, small as it looked from the outside, had been the truest act of care she had ever received from another person. It had told her, without words, that he valued her reality over his own impression, that he wanted her comfort more than her admiration, that he was not interested in the version of her that performed being fine. He was interested in her, the actual her, the one counting coins and showing up anyway, the one honest enough to say the hard thing, the one still building, still becoming, still here. Before we reach the final words of this story, we want to ask you something from the heart. If this story made you feel something real, if Renata's courage moved you or Callum's response gave you hope, if somewhere in this narrative you recognized yourself or someone you love, please leave a comment below and tell us what part stayed with you. Your words are not just engagement on a screen. They are part of why stories like this one continue to be told. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that honesty is brave, that struggle is not shameful, and that the right person will not run from your reality. They will meet you in it. The last thing Renata did before she fell asleep that first night, after the kitchen, after the pasta, after the drive home with the windows down, was send Callum one message. It said simply, "Next time, my kitchen. I also make exceptional pasta." His reply came 4 minutes later. It said, "I'll bring the $11 wine." She had smiled at her phone in the dark of her apartment, with the radiator knocking its familiar rhythm and the city going quiet outside her window, and she had thought, yes, this, exactly this. The small, honest, unpretentious, extraordinary thing. This is what it was always supposed to feel like. Drop a comment right now and tell us, have you ever had a moment where being honest changed everything? We read every single one.